The snow in the Ardennes does not fall like it does in storybooks. In December 1944, it fell like iron filings, heavy, gray, tasting of sulfur. At 0300 hours, the temperature in the foxholes outside St. Vith dropped to 10 degrees below zero. This is not a temperature where men fight. This is a temperature where machines die. The oil in the crankcases turns to sludge. The firing pins on M1 Garand rifles become brittle and snap like glass. But in the tree line, under a canvas tarp stiff with frost, there was a machine that was not sleeping. It was an M16 multiple-gun motor carriage. To the history books, it is a footnote. To the men of the 447th Anti-Aircraft Battalion, it was the meat chopper. To the brigadier general commanding the sector, it was a liability. 3 days ago, that general stood in the mud and issued a direct standing order to his anti-aircraft crews. This vehicle is banned from ground combat. You will keep those guns pointed at the sky. If I catch you firing on infantry, I will court-martial you before the brass hits the ground. The general believed in the rule book. He believed in conserving ammunition for the Luftwaffe. But the general did not hear what the sergeant in the turret currently hears. It is not the whine of an airplane engine. It is the crunch of 2,000 jackboots on frozen crust. It is the sound of the 6th Panzer Army rolling forward to crush the American line. And the only thing standing between the platoon and total annihilation is the one truck they are forbidden to use. The sergeant's hand hovers over the butterfly triggers. He has a choice: obey the order and die, or commit treason and unleash hell. This is the story of the weapon that was banned until the moment it became the only thing that mattered. To understand the weight of this decision, you have to understand the architecture of the chaos. December 16, 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. The greatest intelligence failure in the history of the United States Army. The Allied command believed the Germans were finished. They believed the war was over. They stripped the Ardennes sector of veteran troops and replaced them with exhausted divisions and green recruits who had never heard a shot fired in anger. They called it the Ghost Front. It was supposed to be a quiet sector. They were wrong. Hidden within the dense pine forests under the cover of a perpetual fog that grounded Allied reconnaissance planes, Adolf Hitler had assembled a massive striking force, 20 divisions, 1,000 tanks. The plan was insane but terrifyingly simple. Punch through the weak American center, cross the Meuse River, and split the Allied armies in half. The weather was their greatest ally. For weeks, a suffocating blanket of low clouds neutralized Allied air power. The P-47 Thunderbolts, the tank killers, were stuck on the tarmac in England. Without air cover, the American infantry was blind. This is where the tragedy of the anti-aircraft battalions begins. These units possessed the most devastating firepower in the American arsenal, but they were soldiers without a mission. With the Luftwaffe absent, the AA crews were bored. The generals viewed them as an insurance policy, a reserve to be hoarded against the day the German jets, the M262s, might appear. This hoarding mentality created a rigid, lethal doctrine. The order was explicit. Anti-aircraft guns are for planes only. Firing them at ground targets was considered wasteful. It depleted the barrels, which were difficult to replace. It burned through .50 caliber ammunition that was listed as critical on supply manifests. There was also a pervasive, though legally incorrect rumor that using heavy anti-aircraft guns against personnel was a violation of the Geneva Convention. It wasn't. But the myth paralyzed the command. So, as the Ghost Front slept, unaware of the Leviathan gathering in the woods, the only weapons capable of stopping a human wave attack were sitting under tarps, pointed at the empty sky. Let's dismantle the machine itself. To call the M16 a truck is an insult to engineering. It was a technological predator. Built on the chassis of the M3 Halftrack, it combined the mobility of a tank with the speed of a courier. But the soul of the machine was the turret, the M45 Maxon quad mount. This was a powered turret, driven by a small gasoline engine that charged a set of batteries. It allowed the gunner to spin the weapon 360 degrees in seconds. Mounted on this turret were four M2 Browning heavy machine guns. A single M2 is a weapon of terrifying power. It fires a bullet the size of a man's finger. It can punch through a brick wall at a mile. It turns cover into concealment. When a .50 caliber round hits a human target, it does not drill a hole. It liquefies tissue. It removes limbs. Now multiply that by 4. The M45 mount wired these 4 guns to a single solenoid trigger system. When the gunner pressed the paddles, all 4 guns roared. They were harmonized to a point of convergence. 4 streams of lead meeting in a cone of destruction. If an airplane flew through that cone, it was sawed in half. But there was a catch, a safety feature designed by engineers who sat in warm offices in Detroit. There were depression limiters. These were mechanical steel bolts that prevented the guns from being aimed too low. The idea was to stop an excited gunner from accidentally shooting the driver's cabin or the troops standing in front of the vehicle. These stops meant the guns could not be depressed below a certain angle. This meant the M16 was useless against infantry attacking from ground level. It could shoot the birds, but it couldn't shoot the wolves at the door. Sergeant Miller, the commander of the half-track in question, knew this. He was a mechanic from West Virginia. He didn't care about regulations. He cared about physics. 2 nights before the attack, under the cover of darkness, Miller and his crew committed their first insubordination. They pulled the tarp over the turret to hide the sparks. They took heavy metal files and hand grinders to the turret mechanism. They filled down the depression stops. They ground the steel bolts flush. They altered the gearing. They tested the hand wheel. The guns dipped. They went past the 10-degree safety limit. They went past 0. They went to -10. Now they could aim at the mud 20 feet in front of the truck.
They didn't stop there. They knew the M16 was an open-topped vehicle. The gunner was exposed. They scavenged steel plates from a wrecked Sherman tank and welded them to the sides of the gun tub. It was ugly. It was jagged. It was unauthorized modification of government property. It was the only thing that would save them. The attack did not begin with a shout. It began with the artillery. 05:30 hours. The world ended. 2,000 German guns fired simultaneously. The ground around the platoon's position erupted. Trees shattered into deadly splinters. The phone lines were cut in the first minute. Then came the infantry. The H-106th Division evaporated. The line broke. The road to the headquarters was wide open. Through the morning mist they emerged, the Volksgrenadiers, white snow capes over gray uniforms. They weren't using tactical cover. They were using wave tactics. They blew whistles. They screamed. They fired MP-40s from the hip. The American infantry fired back with M1 Garands and carbines. But a rifle is a precision tool. It cannot stop a tidal wave. For every German that fell, 3 more stepped over him. The Americans were running low on ammo. The perimeter was collapsing. The general, trapped in the command post, watched the tree line. He saw the gray wave washing over the snow. He realized with a heavy heart that his doctrine had failed. He had saved the ammo, but he couldn't save the men. In the barn, 300 yards back, Sergeant Miller heard the screaming. "Mount up," he said. The driver hit the starter. The engine coughed in the cold, then roared. The exhaust filled the barn with blue smoke. Miller climbed into the turret. He strapped himself in. He turned on the electric drive. The turret hummed, a sound like a giant dentist's drill. Opened the doors. The barn doors swung wide. The M16 Halftrack surged out into the snow. It didn't drive cautiously. It drifted around the corner, tracks spinning, throwing up a rooster tail of mud. Miller drove the truck right up to the sandbag wall of the collapsing perimeter. He put himself directly between the retreating platoon and the advancing German army. He spun the turret. The 4 barrels leveled out. The depression stops were gone. The guns pointed parallel to the earth. He squeezed the butterfly triggers. The sound of a quad 50 is not a machine gun sound. It is a jackhammer sound. It is a physical pressure wave that hits the chest. Thump, 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 thump. In 2 seconds, 150 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition tore across the field. Miller didn't fire in bursts. Doctrine says to fire in 6-round bursts to prevent overheating. Miller held the triggers down. The 4 streams of tracers lashed out like a whip of fire. The lead element of the German assault simply vanished. The convergence point was set at 400 yards. The Germans were at 300. The result was not combat. It was landscaping. The heavy rounds punched through the trees the Germans were using for cover. They punched through the engine blocks of the support trucks. They punched through the ranks of the infantry. The German attack stalled. The sheer volume of fire was incomprehensible to them. They were used to fighting rifles. They were facing a weapon system designed to shoot down metal aircraft moving at 300 miles per hour. Against flesh and blood moving at walking speed, it was a massacre. "Reload!" Miller screamed. The loader swapped the 200-round tombstone drums in seconds. Miller fired again. He swept the turret left to right, walking the fire across the German line. The barrels began to smoke. Then they began to glow, a dull cherry red. The heat waves distorted Miller's aim, but he didn't need to aim. He just needed to point. The Germans broke. Men who had survived the Russian front threw down their weapons and ran. The psychological impact of the meat chopper was absolute. It was too loud, too fast, and too destructive to stand against. Miller held the line for 45 minutes. When the guns finally clicked dry, the silence that rushed back into the valley was heavier than the noise. The steam hissed off the barrels. The floor of the half-track was knee-deep in brass casings. Miller slumped in the seat, his hands shaking from the vibration. He looked down. The general was standing next to the track. The general's uniform was torn. He was covered in soot. He looked at the field of carnage. He looked at the smoking, illegal, modified guns. He looked at the filed-down depression stops,
that proved the sergeant had disobeyed a direct order. Miller climbed down. He expected the handcuffs. He expected the stockade. The general walked up to him. He ran a gloved finger along the hot metal of the gun mount. He looked at the survivors of the platoon, men who were only alive because of this machine. The general didn't speak. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out a pack of cigarettes, and offered one to the sergeant. "Get those barrels changed, son, and tell the other crews to file their stops. We're going hunting." The meat chopper of the Ardennes became a legend. The tactics improvised by men like Miller, the armor, the depression stops, the aggressive ground use became standard operating procedure within weeks. The M16 went on to serve in Korea, where it decimated the human wave attacks of the Chinese army. It evolved into the gun trucks of Vietnam. The lesson is written in the snow of 1944. War is not fought on paper. It is not fought in rule books. It is fought in the mud by men who are cold, scared, and desperate. The general banned the truck because he was fighting the war he was taught to fight. The sergeant saved the platoon because he was fighting the war that actually existed. In the end, regulations are just paper, and paper doesn't stop a panzer. Only steel, fire, and the courage to break the rules can do that. But here is the question that should keep you awake tonight. If that sergeant had followed orders, if he had been a good soldier, everyone in that sector would have died. How many other tactical innovations, how many other survival strategies are currently locked away in a filing cabinet, banned by a commander who cares more about the book than the blood? And when the next war comes, will we have enough rule breakers left to win it?